The legal cannabis industry has unlocked generational wealth opportunities across the country. But the industry's regulatory complexities, constant state of change, and speed of evolution drive confusion for entrepreneurs and investors alike. On this podcast, we'll interview the industry leaders who are shaping the future of the legal cannabis industry to help our listeners understand these idiosyncrasies. This is Cannabis Unlocked, hosted by Key Investment Partners.
All right, everybody. Well, welcome back to another episode of Cannabis Unlocked. I'm joined here by Russ Stanley over at Beacon Securities. Really excited to have Russ on the show, especially today, given the recent announcement just within the last hour of Biden announcing a formal pardon of cannabis, minor possession of cannabis offenses, et cetera. We'll get into a little bit in the podcast here, but nonetheless, very exciting. We see the securities ripping up like 30+% today. Obviously a headline driven industry. We'll get into some of those dynamics today, but without further ado, I've got Russ here. Russ has 25 years of experience in the brokerage industry, about 20 years in equity research specifically. He's been a generalist for most of that time, covering a wide variety of sectors until ultimately dedicating himself to the cannabis space in 2016. He's a CFA charter holder and an MBA. And working over at Beacon Securities, which is an independent investment bank based out of Toronto, a bank that has 40+ years of legacy in cannabis, clean tech, diversified healthcare, et cetera. But I don't want to steal Russ's thunder here. So Russ, if you want to introduce yourself to the show here, that'd be great.
Thanks. Russ Stanley. Been in equity research, as you mentioned, for 20+ years. Cannabis the last 6, and I don't think I've ever covered a space that has been this volatile, this exciting, and required this much education, be it on politics, on chemistry, on agriculture, and I'm grateful for my prior experience because I did cover companies from a number of different spaces, and that gives me a number of different lenses through which to see cannabis. And it's been obviously one heck of a ride. And as you noted, today is another one of those days. But we've often joked that a year in cannabis is like 7 years covering any other space. So
Yep.
The voyage continues.
Absolutely, and to your point there. It's a true emerging market, even though it's in our own backyard. Like, you have to get to know this space politically, geographically. I mean, all the way down from the state level down to the municipality to consumer preference, product, services. It's a very fun, exciting space, but certainly a lot of moving parts here. So Russ, curious, you were a generalist for the greater part of your career. Why did you ultimately decide to get involved in the cannabis space?
Sure. I was with a competitor at the time, and a former colleague had moved on to another bank, and he reached out to me and said, we're looking for someone to cover the cannabis space. And this was 2016. Canada. I'm based in Toronto. Canada was still a medical only market at the time, but it was the writing was on the wall. It was going to be the adult use market was going to be legalized. It was a question of how and the details. So the growth potential was obvious. I've covered a number of spaces and covered a number of what you might call themes before, and some of those have longer shelf lives than others. So I was never really certain how long the cannabis story would last, but I was excited by the potential, and there was just a huge opportunity to be telling something new. And in my line of work, you're always trying to tell someone in your shoes something they haven't already heard before. And obviously with cannabis, it was a wide open field, particularly then. And I jumped at the opportunity.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And for anybody listening right now, Beacon publishes a research list that I've been a part of for some time now. And I believe, Russ, you head up the initiative there. It's some of the best cannabis research I've seen. I highly recommend getting yourself on the list if you can, covering the publicly traded companies, et cetera. I guess with that being said, it's a and I would be happy to provide a link or anything that you provide, Russ, that we can give to folks here. Given your time in the space, you've really seen the industry go from kind of I always like to talk in baseball terms. So, you kind of jumped into the industry, I call it the top of the first inning or middle of the first inning.
Mhm.
And I'd say right now, even prior to federal legalization, we're still probably maybe at the bottom of the second inning, top of the third. I wonder what your analogy would be there. But in that period of time, as the industries continue to mature, Canada is now, up and running. More and more states are coming online on this side of the aisle. What are some of the most notable transactions or companies that you've worked with in the industry?
I think certainly following the major MSOs has been fascinating. I started, like many analysts, by covering the Canadian LPs, and then became exposed or met with. I think the first one was probably Green Thumb Industries, also MPX Bioceuticals, which was eventually acquired, and those were the first U.S. operators I did work on, and I was fascinated by the state to state dynamics and understanding the nuances of each market, and so we launched coverage of those names, and certainly following certain markets like Florida with Trulieve and Illinois with Cresco and Verano, as well as GTI. It's always been really exciting to try to understand what impact certain developments are going to have, and which companies are more exposed or more levered to certain developments than others. That's always the biggest question that you get if you're in my seat from in speaking with sales traders or with buy side professionals. So I'd say certainly covering the large MSOs has always been fascinating, because you watch their portfolio build. You saw different strategies, whether it was focusing on retail first or focusing on wholesale first, and then you're seeing more of a convergence of the portfolios. There's an awful lot of overlap geographically. Many are involved in both retail and wholesale in a number of markets, and so now we've kind of transitioned to what I think is a bit more kind of straight home financial analysis and comparing margins.
Yep.
Between companies, margins on EBITDA or cash flow, and really trying to hone in on which companies are really executing from a financial perspective. So it's really transitioned from 3-4 years ago, talking about a story about one company being a play on this market or a play on that market, to now saying this company's EBITDA margins are X% above average, whereas this other companies are they're underperforming. So it's been a fun ride, and the fun's continued. But I'd say the large MSOs are always interesting to watch and to see the different ways they approach the market.
And I would say that most people's views, at least that I speak to, are that the MSOs are likely to be the big winners when federal legalization happens. But I've heard some pretty interesting strategies from the Canadian LPs on their kind of on their plan and their strategy to capture the U.S. consumer as well, once they can get into THC, given they're listed on U.S. exchanges. What is your view on MSO versus Canadian LP? Do you see some, are you able to discuss maybe some folks that you think are going to be big winners, or some of the strategies that you see these guys deploying, and where you think it makes sense?
Sure, and I am a proud Canadian, but all of my coverage is now US. I did start.
So you don't cover them today?
I don't formally cover Canadian LPs at this point. We did publish a piece recently. You may have seen, where we were comparing margins between Canadian LPs and the US operators. We published a piece on the US operators for quite some time, and with the last piece, we took a closer look at the way the Canadians perform, and tragically, they just underperformed the U.S. names almost across the board and on key measures. And some of that is
do you take into account like 280E and some of the other handcuffs that the U.S. MSOs are dealing with? Like, do you kind of remove that to give an apples to apples, or how are you comparing them?
Couldn't really neutralize for that, but I think we also thought in terms of trends and in terms of understanding the histories of these companies. And the U.S. operators were, a little more bootstrapped from the get-go, and then went public, and obviously tapped the markets to fund or to accelerate their growth. But many of them started off as true operators, whereas in the case in Canada, a number of companies, for a time, the moment you were awarded a cultivation license from Health Canada, you were instantly worth 50 million, and access to capital was so much easier. And sadly, we've learned as in all markets, when access to capital is easy or too easy, companies don't always spend it very well. And I think we've seen evidence of that in the margins, and so. I definitely, I definitely favor the U.S. names winning out in the U.S. because they've had to run a tighter ship from a financial perspective. They haven't had the access to capital that Canadian LPs have had, so they've had to spend more carefully, even when spending on a large scale basis for capex, and they know their markets. Better than whenever you're in this case you're betting on an incumbent versus a new entrant, and I think in this case, the incumbents have an awful lot of have a number of advantages over the Canadian LPs. So I would choose the U.S. operators over the Canadian LPs in that context.
Yeah, no, it's a good point that you bring up there, because obviously we operate in the private markets, but from a triangulation of valuation standpoint, we're very close to what the U.S. MSOs or the Canadian LPs are trading at. And I think that that's a narrative that we've hung on to for a long time, and that we actually see a lot, at least in the private space, is that the cost of capital is just so high for these businesses that they've been forced, basically because of the regulatory handcuffs, to operate more efficiently and more effectively, whether that's through just simply better spending on the capex, cutting back on certain costs where they don't have it. Or even some creative accounting methods that we believe that the truly well-run companies will be a light switch of profitability once we get 280E removed. Now, we definitely expect for 280E to be replaced, maybe not fully, but with some sort of social equity tax or whatnot. But nonetheless, you have companies that have been bootstrapped and forced to kind of operate under tighter pressures, which has caused them to be better, more effectively, efficiently run businesses. So switching gears a little bit here, there was some exciting news that just came out in the last hour. President Biden announcing that he's going to pardon 6,500 folks for minor cannabis offenses. And I actually, just right before we got on the podcast, that news story is continuing to develop right now. So I'm excited to see what it sounds like even when we wrap up here. But I saw that he's also encouraging the feds to take a deeper look at cannabis regulations from the federal level, and he's also encouraging governors in legal cannabis states to rethink their cannabis laws as well. Talk to me a little bit about what you think the impact of this is going to be. Obviously, we saw some of the pot stocks jump tremendously in the last hour of trading. Do you think that fundamentally this pardon is going to make a difference to the industry? Or is this posturing to win votes, or does this show a willingness by the administration? I know it just happened, but I'm just curious what your initial kind of intuition is here.
My first stab is certainly it's posturing. Midterms a month away. The White House has been noticeably quiet on the cannabis front. President Biden had been hasn't been viewed as a supporter of cannabis. I think his support has been limited to medical, and he's expressed opposition to adult use. So I think it was always thought that whatever reform we would see would be driven by Congress, and to see something come out of President Biden, obviously the timing is political, but to see anything come out of President Biden, I think is a bit of a surprise. Most of the media had said that the White House has signaled, not to expect anything before midterms. So while it is, I think, politically motivated, even coming a month in advance of midterms is caught a number of people off guard. And I personally was across the street attending a seminar when my
I was caught off guard.
Phone started blowing up, and I raced out and came back. So I think most, just about everyone was caught off guard, and certainly the share prices reflect that. I guess my questions at this point are what does this mean? How long does a review take, and what are the likely recommendations to come back? And my bet is that this is a months, not weeks type process. Absolutely. So it takes time. Secondly, we don't know what the result is going to be. And obviously between now and then we'll have midterms. So, the political need to do anything one way or another may be reduced by the time we have answers as to what the recommendations are for rescheduling, if any. I think the biggest question I have in the immediate term is, what does this mean for the odds of passing safe banking, which is the piece of legislation that I think most people have had their eyes on with respect to cannabis now for many weeks, if not months, and I think there have been growing optimism that we could see SAFE, an amended or augmented version of SAFE, what some call SAFE Plus, get done during the lame duck period after midterms. And it looked like the commentary suggested the odds of seeing something get done there were improving. I'm curious as to what this means for the odds of that happening now. I can imagine some senators feeling more pressure or more comfort to get behind SAFE than maybe they did before the development, and I can see the reverse as well. And in both cases, they might think that, well, President Biden's going to reschedule it or deschedule it in some form, and so maybe I should act now, or maybe I don't have to act at all. And so we'll be watching the kind of the commentary that comes out of the Senate and key senators in particular, and see what this means for activity. So obviously we think the motivation was to win some votes, but in a true policy sense, I'm curious as to what it means for SAFE after midterms.
Yeah, that's great. And you actually brought something up that I had never really considered before. I'll be completely honest with you. I was very caught by surprise with the announcement today. I was not expecting to hear that. I've heard rumors of maybe a joint medical marijuana descheduling bill coming in from a Democrat and a Republican, maybe this week or next week. And I was kind of waiting around to hear that. But when I saw the headline of Biden making this pardon announcement, it really did catch me by surprise. Now, if maybe descheduling or rescheduling is on the table, what does that mean, for SAFE? Would rescheduling marijuana to 2 or 3, does that open up banking? Does that open up credit cards? Or what would happen in that sense?
I don't think it opens up banking or credit cards necessarily. Certainly not at 2, and I'd have to see at 3. I mean, it's I think, and I could be off on this one. I know that I guess heroin and LSD are Schedule 1, but it's always been pointed out that cannabis is Schedule 1, but I think cocaine is Schedule 2.
Yeah,
or Schedule
cocaine
3.
and meth are Schedule 2, which is nuts to me because I've seen what it does to the people on the streets in Denver, and certainly seems worse than marijuana.
Yeah, so I think there's certainly some other substances a little lower down on the scheduling that I don't think we would view as legal. So again, that's part of what we mean when we say we need to see what the recommendations are. Is it down to 2, down to 3, or is it just eliminated altogether? That'll be a big driver. But if it's just taken down to 2 or 3, I don't think that necessarily opens banking, because merely reducing cannabis to cocaine level, I don't think that necessarily gets you where you need to be. But that remains to be seen.
Well, hopefully that means that while this is all being figured out in Washington, SAFE is still viable and very much alive. I certainly know that this is something that we've been waiting for a long time, and it does feel, at least from our point of view, that this is the best chance we've ever had at passing SAFE. Now, with that being said, I probably wouldn't give it more than a coin flip of a 50-50. Simply put, we're in the business of underwriting deals, and I'd rather underwrite a deal to what the status quo is today and just be surprised on the upside. But look, simply put, I don't want to put my eggs in one basket and be heartbroken when the lame duck passes and SAFE doesn't pass. So yeah, I'm really curious to see what this means. A lot of the chatter out there is, and I think Congress has done this in many other industries. It's usually incremental reform. You don't usually just see a kind of a shotgun. Hey, ultimately, federal legalization just happens all at once. Do you think that this pardon and now the presidential order for the feds to go in and rethink about cannabis and asking governors to think about cannabis in their states, does that put us on a path towards faster federal legalization? I mean, the stock market certainly looks like it thinks that that's what that means. I don't think I fall into that category. I think that, again, this is probably just posturing for votes, but I wonder what this could mean for the incremental push towards federal reform.
Well, I think that, and I've never been a politician, but if I was a politician, I would who otherwise wasn't a fan of cannabis, I would look at this and say it's inevitable, and the best I can do now is perhaps slow it,
Sure.
or at least if allowing it to pass, in an extremely controlled way. And so, and my point there is that I still think today's development supports incremental reform rather than seeing a full legalization in the near term, because I can imagine politicians deciding to get behind something like SAFE, which isn't legalization, of course.
Right.
For viewers, it would just simply allow federally regulated financial institutions to deal with state legal cannabis companies. So it is not legalization. It is something that can appeal to members of both parties, because currently there's public safety concerns around cash and how much cash is floating around in dispensaries and so forth. So I think there's a motivation, and that's something that can be sold to people who don't like cannabis, and we believe we have there is support from people who are not cannabis supportive, but they are public safety supportive. And similarly, if you've just seen Biden's announcement and you're thinking, okay, this might be a big step towards legalization, but if we get behind SAFE and it passes, that might mean taking away some of the pressure, some of the urgency to go full legalization. So, and it might seem a little counterintuitive, but by passing SAFE, you might slow the roll. And I don't think my thinking on that is new. I think that sort of logic is part of what was governing the Senate Majority Leader's thinking, and Senators Booker and Wyden over a year ago. When they consistently indicated opposition to passing SAFE before looking at their bigger, broader legalization bill. It was the same thinking, that if you take a small step forward, you might stop yourself from taking a giant leap, and that, I think, is a scenario we're looking at today. So I can imagine people still getting behind safe banking in order to slow the broader legalization roll, if you will.
Yeah, well, I can certainly tell you, as someone who's been in the trenches for some time now, the cannabis industry is way overdue for any tailwinds, and it's kind of funny that now we're in this position where it's like, do we pass SAFE? Do we push towards federal legalization? I mean, from my point of view, let's get something done. I mean, something needs to change. I think safe banking is honestly probably makes the most sense for the industry today. Federal legalization, I think, is going to be something that, even if it happened tomorrow, would take years to figure out. I think that the states would likely, do whatever they could to hold on to the cannabis economies that they've created for themselves. Mm-hmm. And safe banking is really going to be helping who was supposed to be helped from the get-go in this whole movement. This is supposed to be helping the mom and pop operators. I mean, we all know that the MSOs, et cetera, sure, cost of capital is high compared to other businesses, but they're not really having trouble finding or accessing capital. Maybe it's costing a little bit more, but it's really the mom and pops, the folks at the grassroots movement level of this whole thing, that are being hurt by the banking restrictions today. So I think SAFE would be very, very much the immediate right thing to do, but nonetheless, we'll see. I'm also not a politician, so I wouldn't place a bet on anything that I'm saying here. I'd rather just say stick to the fundamentals and invest on that. So with that being said, I'm curious. I always like to wrap up the podcast with asking for your advice. Like, what kind of advice would you maybe give? I guess, given today's announcement, sometimes I ask for what advice would you give to companies, or what advice would you give to cannabis investors? I think today, maybe it's more relevant to say, what kind of advice would you give to cannabis companies with regards to the headlines floating around out there?
I I don't think they need the advice, because I think they always tell the street that they plan their business around the world as it is today. And not unlike your comments earlier, you underwrite a deal on the status quo, and if you get a tailwind on the regulatory or legislative side, then all the better. And I think that's the approach that most cannabis companies take, and I would advise them to continue with that approach. And certainly in this, given the macro headwinds that we're otherwise facing and the broader equity market, behaving the way it has, you'd say, take things the same way that you have. Don't change your playbook, but just be cautious with your capital, because external capital is getting tougher to find. As you noted, the large MSOs still have access to capital. It is expensive by normal business standards, but it's still less expensive than small company standards. But on the whole, for any company that goes looking for money right now, it's just going to be tougher and more expensive than it would have been a year or 2 years ago. And so for cannabis companies, I'd say this is just a headline. We don't see any policy changes yet, and continue on with your plans, which were based on the status quo as far as the legislative environment was concerned.
I think that's very, very sound and smart advice. Well, Russ, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I think for anybody tuning into this episode, you're going to learn a lot about the state of the markets today, and what the potential outcomes are for not only the announcement today, but how we should be thinking about SAFE. And ultimately, we get a lot of investors that tune in here, how you should be thinking about underwriting your investment opportunities in the space. So thank you, Russ, again for having you. I look forward to continuing our relationship offline here. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I mentioned that Russ has that awesome research report and list that they're on. So if you guys are interested in getting onto that, please reach out. We will also have a link or instructions on how you could potentially sign up for that research there too. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Russ.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.